Atlantis, we haven't found yet. It's somewhere, I believe, but like the broken machine, it hasn't been discovered. But there's a lot of evidence that shows that there must have been an Atlantis, and there's a lot of implications from the fact that there was one. So bear with me, and what I will be trying to do in this short time is to not change your mind, which will be almost impossible, but to raise the level of the Atlantis thinking to a controversy, so that instead of it being a fantasy, an interesting fantasy, it is taken seriously by people who think seriously. That's my objective. Now, in order to think about Atlantis in a different frame of mind, one must get out of the habit of thinking linearly. That is, the way Americans, the way the Western world approaches their thinking on history, on civilization, is that it began 4000 BC in Mesopotamia, developed in Egypt, got a great surge in Greece, took off in the Renaissance, reached a peak in the Enlightenment, and we are the continuers of this tradition so that it's upward and onwards with the arts in a linear fashion. But this is not how it's thought of in India, for example, or in other parts of the world. In India, you may know, especially those of you who have taken my course on the history of Asian art and architecture, which, by the way, there are leaflets on the table, which you can pick up afterwards if you're interested. The Hindus think that the world goes in cycles, that there is no beginning and there is no end. It's a circular thing. This is how the Mayans thought of it as well. So that the Hindu view is that in the beginning there was Vishnu, and Vishnu was asleep on the cosmic ocean, resting on Anyanta, the huge cobra with the 7 hoods, as you see here in the sculpture. And it dawns on him that it's time to call the world into existence again. And so he does. And from his navel comes a lotus, and from the lotus comes Brahma. Brahma creates the world, and Shiva dances it into existence. And so the world begins again until it ends, and we are nearing the end of its last cycle, or we are in the last of its phase, and then it'll all begin again. So we must think in terms of civilization. Did civilization begin in 4000 BC in Mesopotamia, or did it have an earlier beginning? And if this is the second time around, or maybe third or fourth time around, and that something was lost, and there it is, somewhere to be found. That's my thesis, and I really believe that. So, here, if you can see it well enough, is one man's view of Atlantis. The dark part here, the dark islands, here and here. Kondratov, a Russian scientist, felt that this is where Atlantis was, in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic. More than two, actually. But the point about Atlantis, and there's so many theories about where was it and how many parts, is that it was not a part or not a place, but a civilization. Many places, all at once, interrelated, going back before 10,000 BC, who knows how many thousands of years. And other places include Lemuria in the Indian Ocean and in Indonesia, in his view. Everybody who writes on the subject picks like a different place. So you take your choice, A, B, or none of the above. Now, what seems to have happened at the end of the Ice Age, the world, which ended about 15,000 BC, the waters of the ice in the poles and in Greenland melted, and the seas rose maybe 300 or 400 feet. And this apparently did happen, and in their happening, they inundated the coastlines of places all over the world, so that what you see here is the area in India, in China, in Indonesia, Australia, all had a higher level, but when the oceans rose, they inundated the land, and not only inundated the land, but they inundated the highest level of civilization of Atlantis, which naturally was on the coasts, because Atlantis, if you accept Theodol's experiment with the Kon-Tiki and so forth, they could travel the oceans thousands of years ago. If you accept that view, then you could see that the civilizations were interrelated by commerce. The cities grew on the coasts were inundated, and the civilization did what? The civilization died. Except for what? Except for those who had one of two things: escaped in time and gone elsewhere, or had previously set up colonies and commercial relations with other countries, and so their influence spread around the world, and their knowledge of science, the arts, and commerce, and of civilization was already spread. The man, what type of evidence do we have? The first level of evidence is Plato. Now, Plato, you probably know, is really what kicked off this whole controversy, because he, being a foremost philosopher of the 4th century BC, and no lightweight, and very much believed and accepted, in his Timaeus and Critias, he wrote about Atlantis. How did he know about Atlantis? Because he picked it up via another man named Solon, who in the 6th century BC had gone to Egypt, and in Egypt had visited the sages and the wise men and the archives, and they told them about the history of the world as seen by Egypt. So Plato wrote about this in his writings, and people ever since have been saying, oh, we think very much of Plato, but in this case, he's having delusions. He's having fantasies that there just could not have been any other civilization, because things were just too primitive. In our scheme of things began in 4000 BC, and before that, we have only primitive man, and very little by way of civilization, if anything. But we have different places in the world. What I'm showing here is Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley civilization. This is India. Here is Mohenjo-Daro. Here's Dwarka, and here's the area shown light that was inundated. Now, the history of the world has been geared to accepting the paradigm of what we have tended to believe about how civilization began. The alternate paradigm, which is hopefully competing, has it that one of the original civilizations, which included Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley and the Yellow River, began about 1500 BC or 2000 BC, no earlier, and that it owed its success to the Aryan invasion, which came about 1500 BC, and thus we have the beginnings of Indian civilization. But other people who have followed the Atlantis paradigm say, no, that's not what happened, that the Indus Valley began much earlier, thousands of years earlier, beginning in here, where Dvorka is, here, and the reason why you have the Indus Valley is that they were escaping from the inundation and they migrated to higher land, to inland, and set up civilization again. So that the remarkable things that we know about the Indus Valley, with its great engineering and its interesting art and its planned cities, this came not because it developed in the Indus Valley, for which there was little sign of a development, but because it was borrowed from another civilization. And the question of where these civilizations became, did they originate in Egypt or in Indus Valley, etc., or were they borrowed from somewhere else? What we need about to have a scientific view of this. And by the way, the previous speaker, if you were here last week, and I spoke to him, and we compared notes. I said, well, what are you going to do today? I'm talking about the brain. He said, I'm giving a scientific lecture. I said, well, that's good. Well, I'm talking about Atlantis. Oh, he said, well, that's interesting, but that's not a scientific lecture. So my pretense or my intent is to raise this to a level of science insofar as we can, without having a brain to dissect or a billion people with brains. There is no Atlantis that we've discovered yet for sure, but we know a lot about the circumstances that surround it. So that is evidence. And the second requisite for science is that it offer a worldview, a unified view that explains events coherently. And that's what we demand of science. And I think in both cases, this succeeds. So we explain the origin of the Indus Valley not by a certain strange circumstance that all of a sudden there are planned cities and remarkable engineering, but they borrowed it from another civilization. And this is Mohenjo-Daro as it is today. And the great baths at Mohenjo-Daro. And one of the small pieces of sculpture that was found here, which the art historians call the high priest. But there's very little evidence of there being any priests, let alone high priests, in the Indus Valley. But this is sophisticated art. The person may not be native. We think now that the Indus Valley were people of Dravidian descent from Lemuria, which I showed earlier, from the island that I showed in the Indian Ocean. But the greatest of all the people that are involved in Atlantis today, in my opinion, is a journalist. Graham Hancock, that young man in the blue shirt, who's written books that you might like to be acquainted with, like Fingerprints of the Gods. And he took to the study of archaeology and of paleoarchaeology, and even took up deep-sea diving, underwater diving, because he felt that if Atlantis was there, there should be evidence of it that he could find by diving in the waters. And so he did. And this is Dwarka that I mentioned before, off the coast of India. These ruins are dated 1700 BC, but they may be much older, perhaps 3200 BC or much earlier. So what he claims he found are man-made stones that had to be part of buildings that were destroyed, and that this is the remains of these buildings. Frankly, it's not conclusive. It's tantalizing, but not conclusive. But there are many areas like it which have evidence, including, as I said before, China and Indonesia. China is interesting from another point of view, in that, like many examples of art, I've come to the conclusion that the teaching of art history somehow is not logical by the logic that we've come to develop, and that it often starts at the top. It starts at its most developed. As we shall see in Egypt, when we talk about the Sphinx and the pyramids, we are talking about a peak of development beginning at a very early time. And when we talk about China, we notice that some of its greatest artworks, like its jade work and its bronze work, were of a very fine, sophisticated nature, very difficult technologically to make because jade is extremely hard, and yet there it was amongst the earliest work that China produced artistically. So where did they get it from? My view is that the sunken areas on the east coast of China that at one time combined Japan, Korea, and China was the source of the art which was borrowed from China, so that at its earliest stages it developed high level of art. And there is a very troublesome art figure, or collection of art figures, that they found in Sichuan. It's about 6 feet high. This statue, and it's a bronze figure holding his hands in a strange fashion, as if holding some sort of mast. Obviously not Chinese in appearance. It's a group of sculptures that are found not only in Sichuan but around China in many places, and it has no place in the history of Chinese art. So it can't be disregarded, so it's included in the art books, but no one can offer a satisfactory explanation. But if you consider that the artworks were influenced in China, as they were in India and Egypt, by outside sources, earlier outside sources, then this makes sense. And their bronze work, if you ever go to the Asian art museums, you certainly want to see the ancient bronzes. And their most magnificent work is their earliest work. As for Egypt, and this became the episode that really, I think, was the turning point in creating of Atlantis theory a scientific possibility, is the Sphinx. Now, one bright day, a man named Schock, S-C-H-O-C-K, went to visit the Sphinx on an expedition. And he was asked by others, tell us about the weathering of the Sphinx, because its body, as you can see, is evidently weathered. It's worn. Not a head, but the body and the walls from which the Sphinx was sculpted. This 240-foot-long sculpted piece coming out of the Giza plateau. And he looked at it as a geologist and he said, well, obviously the body of this Sphinx was weathered by water, by rain. So all the archaeologists around him said, well, it's very nice of you to say that, but have another think, because there was no rain. And in the period of the beginning of Egyptian civilization, which we date from about 3100 BC, there was no rain. It was a desert. It was dry, and certainly not enough rain to weather a statue like this. And his answer was, you guys work it out yourselves. I can tell you, I know my geology. This bird has been weathered by rain. Well, they said, but the earliest rain dates back to about 5,000 to 6,000 BC. That's your problem, he said. That's not my problem. So if the Sphinx, you see, did not begin when Egypt began, and it began thousands of years earlier, when there was nobody around to do it, so they say, how did it get there? Who did it? And this is what broke the back, in my opinion, and will historically, as this whole thing gets evaluated, of the accepted paradigm about world civilization. It was done by other people at other time. Who, they said? Well, other people have answered this in this manner. They said the people from Atlantis came to Egypt as either refugees or as part of their commerce, brought their knowledge with them, advanced technological knowledge, and they're the ones that made it possible for the Sphinx to be sculpted. I don't know if you've heard this theory before, but it's quite interesting. Now this picture, the Sphinx was sculpted out of the stone, the limestone of the Giza plateau. And the walls are weathered just as the body of the Sphinx is weathered in this manner. So this is a picture of the stone, of the walls, as they were look now. And if you'll notice, there are two things. There's the rounded part here, which conceivably could be wind or rain, but the vertical fissures, you see, is what convinced Schock that rain is what makes the vertical fissures, in addition to the undulating walls. And here's the Sphinx. Underneath it, it has been determined, some chambers. But the Egyptian government has made it impossible to investigate them, closed to scientific investigation. From what I've read and what I believe myself, under the Sphinx there are many chambers, just as under the pyramids there are many chambers. And what's in those chambers? In those chambers is the knowledge of the previous civilization that has been stored for mankind to discover when he's ready to find it. If you notice, too, that the head of the Sphinx is really quite small in relation to the body, the lion body. It's supposed to be a lion body with a pharaoh head. The pharaoh is supposed to be Khephren, 4th dynasty pharaoh. Along with the geologist was another man who came to investigate the plateau in Giza. And who was he? He was a cop from New York. And why did they bring a cop from New York to Egypt? Because he was a man who could determine, by looking at the faces of victims, of homicide victims, who they were. He could recognize. That was his expertise on the police force. So they said, here's the Sphinx and here's his head. And then they took him to see a statue of Khephren, which is in one of the temples. And he said, "Is this the same guy?" And he said, "No way. This is not the same guy. These are two different people. This is something else." So he threw doubt on the whole theory of why the Sphinx was built to depict the Pharaoh. So why was the Sphinx built? And here we get into the crux of the matter. It seems that in 9600 BC, there was a great disaster that befell the world. How do we know this? Because the effects of it showed up in the rocks and lava that have been investigated, so that it coincides with inundation, which they know happened around the world, and it coincides with other things. Let me lose myself here. Well, let me go on. Let me look at this for a minute. What the Sphinx is looking at in this picture is a lion. And who is that lion? That lion is Leo. And Leo is one of the stages on the zodiac. So that it is argued that this Sphinx represents the appearance of Leo on the horizon at the equinox in 1050 BC, and that this is commemorated by the building of the Sphinx. And why is that date chosen? It's chosen because it's the beginning of the new time. And this is in the Egyptian writings, where they write about the beginning of the new time. But they feel that 3100 BC was not the beginning of Egyptian civilization, but that it began thousands of years before, that the descendants of Osiris, their god, became pharaohs, earlier pharaohs, pre-dynastic pharaohs, and that all began in 10,500 BC. And this is what they're commemorating, the beginning of this year. And why are they commemorating it? Because this, they say, is the time when these great gifts were brought to Egypt. This is how Egypt developed its civilization and how it developed its its knowledge of construction and its religions and so forth. So, the pyramids of Giza, there was another man who came to Egypt who made an astounding discovery. His name is Bauval, B-A-U-V-A-L. And it is said that he was actually reclining or lying on the desert by the pyramids, the three pyramids, looking up at the sky. And he got a marvelous thought. He said, the belt of Orion, here, these three stars are in the belt of Orion. And he said, those three stars and these three pyramids are the same. That these pyramids on the ground represent the stars in the belt of Orion. It was an epiphany. He was astounded. Nobody had ever thought of that before. But there was a catch. The layout of the pyramids did not represent the stars in the belt of Orion as he saw them. But with the aid of the computer, he was able to discover the appearance of the stars of the belt of Orion in 10,500 BC. And in 10,500 BC, they lined up exactly like the pyramid. Now, this is tough evidence, you know. This is stuff that can't be just wished away by, oh, this is all just fantasy and it doesn't mean anything, it's just coincidence. It's really important. But when it was asked when the pyramids were built, they found something strange too. That the pyramids have in them, especially the big pyramid, Khufu or Cheops, shafts that are built into the pyramid, like this, looking north and south. And those north and south shafts, which were always thought to be air shafts, turned out to be astronomical shafts, which focus on the belt of Orion and focused on on Draco, the constellation, to the north and to the south. So what I've been reading is that, yes, the pyramids do date from 2600 BC, like they're supposed to, like we've been told. And because they do line up with those stars at that time. But that the whole Giza Plateau, which includes the Sphinx and the stars and the pyramids and the temples that are there, are part of a master plan which was set up thousands of years ago and only completed by 2600 BC. That's a little hard to take, that a plan would take so long to come to fruition, but it seems to make sense. And here are the pyramids. Now, what about the pyramids? You perhaps heard that they are constructed in some amazing ways. First of all, their orientation, north, south, east, and west, is perfect. They found out that the large Khufu pyramid is a replica in its dimensions. The ratio of its perimeter at the base to its height at the center is the same as the circumference of the Earth as half the axis of the Earth. In other words, that pyramid is a picture on the Earth of the Earth's northern hemisphere. It is the northern hemisphere in proportion. There are stones that are included in these pyramids that are, the typical stone is not so large, maybe 2.5 tons, but there are stones that go up to 200 tons that are used in the interior of these pyramids. Now, this has always been a big problem. How do you move a big stone? I happen to know that if you go to a steel plant, or any plant, that has an indoor crane, and it tries to lift up by that crane, which is running on the two walls, and it's picking up something, that the most it could do is 30 tons. The very most is 30 tons. Something 200 tons is out of the question. You have to build a very, very special crane to build something like 100 tons. How do the Egyptians, who knew supposedly very little about these matters, how were they able to do this? Well, the standard explanation is they dragged them. And there are pictures on the temple walls showing hundreds and hundreds of Egyptian workers pulling on a sled that's pulling a stone. So it is possible. But when you get up to the 100 and 200 ton category, it becomes highly impractical, especially if you're building a pyramid, because it means you've got to drag it up a slope. The slope has to be miles long. The slope has to be made of stone or it would collapse. You can't maneuver the people around to get them in a tight enough space to get it up there, there are a lot of problems. But not impossible. So, what did they know about lifting stones that we don't know? Well, what did they know about a lot of things that we don't know? That's the question. If there was, at that time, a world civilization with advanced technologies, what are the things that they knew that we don't know now that enabled them to do different things? And here's a diagram of the 3 pyramids. And it shows, there's your, here's the 3 pyramids. Here's the large one, middle one, and the smaller one. And there are the temples. There are a lot of things they're finding out about this whole thing. And it gets infinitely complex, that the whole thing is part of a Fibonacci series of numbers laid out like a spiral. I try to read this, I can't figure it out. But you might know that there are a lot of things to think about. There's the question of orientation. Now, this seems to be what has occurred in history. What was this disaster that took place around 9600? How big was it? Where is Atlantis if it was in the middle of the Atlantic? The catastrophe theory that makes the most sense to me, not at first, but I think now, is what we call crustal displacement. Crustal displacement. That is, excuse me while I duck in here, if you think of the Earth as an orange has an orange peel, then the crust of the orange peel is like the crust of the Earth. And inside, there is a mantle next to the crust, and within is a more or less solid core, which spins in its own way, not in conjunction with the rest of the Earth. Every so often, the crust and its interior go out of sync. And when this happens, the crust moves. And the crust, according to the theory of crustal displacement, moved 2,000 miles. And that it shifted, and all of it shifted, not just a part of it. This is not Earth tectonics. Earth tectonics has just a small movement of the continents. This is the movement of the whole surface. So that, if let your imagination run with this, because it's marvelous, is that the Atlantis, which was probably outside of Spain, in the Atlantic, moved down to the south, as did the whole crust, shifting and swiveling, and became Antarctica. And that Antarctica is Atlantis. And Antarctica is covered in great part by 2 miles of ice. But under the ice and throughout Antarctica are the remains of animals and plants that have nothing to do with the polar region. How did they get there? And if the global warming proceeds on schedule, which we hope it won't, and if the ice melts and 2 miles of it disappear, then maybe Atlantis will be exposed. It's a very interesting idea, but it does solve the problem of how do you get what Plato said was a landmass, which was as big as a continent. How do you hide it? And there's people who have looked in the Atlantic on the bottom of the ocean say, there's no big landmass here. It can't be here, but it can be Antarctica. So that's a thought for the day. And once you get that in your head, you won't get rid of it so easy, because it has to be disproven. There are other things. What I'm showing here is, well, why are they going through all this trouble of making pyramids and sphinxes and mortuary temples and sphinx temples and all these things in Giza? Two reasons. The reason that makes most sense to me is that they believed in a cyclical development of history, and that if the disasters of 9600 BC could come back again, there's two things they want to know. One, when? And two, how do we avoid it? In order to determine when, they made of the Giza, of the pyramids, astronomical observatories. And they reasoned that because all peoples have religion of some sort, and the Egyptians saw all of this through their religious eyes. Their pharaohs were god kings. And they said, if our gods can go up to the heavens and be amongst the stars, they might have some influence. They might be able to do something about it. So, these two reasons, they felt that they had to work on this. And what made them think, their big thinking about what caused this problem was that they noticed that the sun rises over the years amongst different stars, amongst different constellations. And that slowly, as the sun rises on the spring equinox, you could see just before it rises in the east, different constellations, the whole zodiac, over a 26,000-year period. And 1 degree over a 72-year period. And they felt that this shifting of the sun amongst the stars, this is what's causing the problem. This is what we call the precession of the equinoxes. And this is what they wanted to study and know about, and this is what everything was geared to. Something we hardly think about, actually. So what? Precession. But this is what they felt is what's different up there. Everything is the same, more or less, but the precession of the equinoxes, that's changing. This is what must be causing the problem. And they noticed that in 10,500 AD, they considered that the beginning of one of the precessions. And that time for them, earliest Egyptian, began then. And they were going to track these precessions with the Sphinx and with the pyramid. And they were going to store all the knowledge they knew about the universe from these earliest peoples in chambers in Giza underneath, which the Egyptian government, I believe, does not want to reveal or open for their own reasons. Well, here's a picture of dragging 60-ton statue using 900 men in harness, according to a man named Tompkins. Quite an undertaking. And here is Osiris, who his image, he becomes a star. When he died, he went and became a star in Orion. Or so they believe. And as a matter of fact, the Egyptians think of all of Egypt as a replica of the heavens, so that the Nile is the Milky Way. And the stars, not only the pyramids, but all the basic pyramids of Egypt were laid out according to the heavens. So they were duplicating on the ground what they saw up above. All over the world, the concept of a flood, of a disaster, hundreds and hundreds of people believe that this is the case. It can't be coincidence. We have our Noah's Ark, but everybody has something. Something must have happened to convince people that there was an event that destroyed the world. A few people survived. They started over. And many people think that there was a great man that came to them, or a group of wise men who came to them. And this is what happened to the Aztecs. The Aztecs, as you know, were waiting for one of the wise men to come back, one of the early men. And when the Spaniards came in 1519, they thought Quetzalcoatl was him. And they thought he was the god coming back as he had promised. And they welcomed him with open arms. And of course, arms is what they got, but they were military. In Peru, with Pizarro, you have Viracocha, a similar type of god figure who they were waiting for. And Pizarro came, and they were disappointed. In my view, I would add to that, which nobody ever mentioned, that the Spaniards knew. They knew of this myth of the Aztecs, and they knew that they could count on being welcomed this way, which is why a few hundred or maybe 1,000 Spanish soldiers were able to conquer 15 million Indians, because they had this knowledge that they would be welcome. Well, it's a great story, and it's a world story. I haven't got time. I'm going to run out of time very quickly. But here's Orion and the Milky Way, you see. Things that we were told about Mesopotamia, the ziggurat. Interesting that these people could make a ziggurat. Yes, very interesting. The levels of the ziggurat, they found out, are Mercator projections of the world in proportion, so that these different levels were actually a map of the world made three-dimensional in the ziggurat. And they painted on these walls so that they had a map of the world. This was where did they learn this? Where did it happen? How did it come about? It had to be borrowed from an earlier people who had themselves thousands of years to develop this. In Baalbek, which was we know for its Roman ruins in the era of Nero, there is a block that has never been fully quarried, 1,000 tons. How did they ever think? Whose block is that? Not the Romans. They could not handle this. There had to be earlier people who thought that they could handle a 1,000-ton block. But no one knows how. How did they do it? One of the pieces of evidence, and I guess I'll have to leave you after this, of the earlier times was that they were maps. They were maps that came to light in the 15th, 16th century that showed Antarctica without ice. But we didn't know what Antarctica looked like without ice until recently. But they knew. That means whoever first mapped these maps, who made them, must have made them before there was ice in Antarctica. It means they must have been made while Antarctica was ice-free, was further north, had not yet shifted by crustal displacement to become Antarctica, as we know it today. So these maps are considered but they're controversial, maps of Antarctica before their time. I have to stop because I want to leave a question period. I'm really only half through. But enough, I think, to awaken your thinking, to raise it, as I said, to a level of some sort of controversy, and to give it serious consideration to think of the works of guys like Beauval and Tompkins and others that I have here if you're interested. And I hope you enjoyed my voyage of fantasy.